Welcome to the PCN Capitol Preview. I'm Francine Schertzer. Today we'll talk about the upcoming election. But first, we're joined by John Cole, reporter for the Pennsylvania Capital Star. Over the weekend, Governor Josh Shapiro appeared on behalf of Kamala Harris's Fighting for Reproductive Freedom campaign in Philadelphia. It's been over 2 years since the Dobbs decision. Is abortion still a significant issue in this election?
Thanks for having me on, Francine. Certainly, Vice President Harris's campaign has made it a point to talk about abortion access all throughout the country. And as you mentioned, this bus tour at this point in time has gone through, I believe, 5 or 6 states. This week, as we speak, it is going through Pennsylvania. It kicked off on Sunday in the city of Philadelphia in Old City, about 200 people in attendance. And as a matter of fact, to your point of do voters still care about this issue, I specifically asked Governor Josh Shapiro after he delivered remarks about where does this issue fall in terms of importance for Pennsylvania voters. And the response he gave me is that since the Dobbs decision in which Roe v. Wade was overturned, he said, look at the statewide elections and see that Democrats who have been running on abortion access have been winning. He pointed to his victory in 2022 over State Senator Doug Mastriano, U.S. Senator John Fetterman winning his race, and then the state Supreme Court race. Having said that, though, that's not the only issue, of course, on the minds of voters, but it's something that Harris's campaign has talked about since she became the nominee. And even when Joe Biden was at the top of the ticket for Democrats, it clearly is an issue that Democrats are talking about at length. And at this point, polling seems to show, I believe there's an ABC News poll published a few days ago, and it had issues that voters trust the candidates on. The issue that Harris polled highest was abortion access. So that's an issue where across the spectrum, she polled highly, where former President Donald Trump, the Republican Party's candidate for president, polled highest when it came to immigration. So it's pretty clear why both candidates are taking the tack they are, where we've seen Trump talk a good amount about immigration on the campaign trail. National polling has indicated he's polled much better than Harris there. However, Harris polling stronger with abortion access, which I think is why it's certainly been a key issue for her campaign this cycle thus far.
Now, you covered the Philadelphia stop on this campaign tour. How would you describe both the attendance as well as the tone of the event?
Sure. So again, I think around 200 people on a Sunday afternoon, solid attendance in Old City. We know that for Democrats to win statewide in Pennsylvania, they need to have big numbers out of the city of Philadelphia, certainly. Philadelphia being the state's largest city, and it's a Democratic stronghold. So I think, again, attendance was solid there. And it's a point where I think that this issue is certainly a statewide issue, but in particular, I think the Philadelphia area, I think they're really stressing it. Where I remember a few months ago, I think this may have been March, if I'm not mistaken, when President Joe Biden was at the top of the ticket still. The day after the State of the Union, his first speech post-State of the Union address was in the Philadelphia suburbs in Delaware County. And he talked a lot about abortion access in that speech to suburban voters. This was in the city of Philadelphia. It seems as though the issue, again, abortion access, I think is an issue statewide, as Governor Shapiro mentioned in his answer to me, but I think they're really talking about that point a lot in Philadelphia and the collar counties.
Now, Governor Shapiro made a comment during the event that women are going to vote in this election. Do you think having Kamala Harris at the top of the ticket will perhaps encourage or support other women candidates on down ticket races?
That's a great question, Francine. I suppose we'll have to let the polling play out as it's going on. We've seen a bevy of polls over the past few weeks since Harris has been at the top of the ticket, a few since last week's presidential debate in Philadelphia as well, in which it is so close in Pennsylvania, neck and neck, where I guess polling has shown that Harris is performing better with women voters and Trump better with male voters. However, there's still, 49 days, I think, if I'm not mistaken? 49 days until the presidential election. So we'll see how much changes in the next few weeks, but because we know that polls are a snapshot in time. But at this point in time, it does appear to me that, for women voters, polling has suggested thus far that Harris is performing well with them. But there are still these undecided voters that exist. And Pennsylvania, just to stress, I know we're seeing it in every commercial, and those who are following it closely, it is so close from most polling we're seeing right now. So I think that is an issue. It'll be interesting to see how it continues to develop. And those undecided voters out there, I'm curious to see the pitches that Trump and Harris makes in Pennsylvania specifically for the next 7 weeks.
Former Republican Congressman Jim Greenwood was in attendance at Sunday's event. What do you make of the fact that there are a number of Republican elected leaders or former elected leaders that are backing the Kamala Harris campaign?
Correct. So former Congressman Jim Greenwood, who is a Republican from Bucks County, he is actually part of the Harris Republicans for Harris coalition. I was on that press call a few weeks ago, announcing that coalition. Congressman Greenwood did not speak at this rally, to be clear, but I asked him before in the past about why is he supporting Vice President Harris, and he's made the case that there are Republicans he's supporting down ballot. He specifically mentioned Republican Congressman Brian Fitzpatrick in Bucks County. So there are these people who split their tickets, and I guess the case that Congressman Greenwood, and other Republicans have made is that they don't like the direction in which the Republican Party has gone with former President Donald Trump at the top of the ticket for now the third straight election in a row. So I guess I'm curious to see how many of these Republicans are willing to split their tickets, because that could have a role, particularly in areas I would say Bucks County in particular really comes to mind for me, because Bucks County is an area that is very much known for splitting their tickets. Republican congressmen at the top of the ticket. Biden won last time at the top of the ticket. Statewide candidates that are Democrats typically do well. So splitting the ticket really may well have a very big impact on this election. And look at some of those collar counties like Bucks County and your swing areas like Erie County up in Northwest PA, and then Northampton County in the Lehigh Valley.
Now, as you continue your election coverage over the next 7 weeks, are there specific guideposts or things that you'll look for from the candidates, or perhaps from a reaction to the candidates, to give some kind of indication of who you think might come out as the victor?
Another great question, Francine. Again, I've been able to go to a decent amount of these events this far, and I can tell you there's plenty more than I'll be going to in the very near future. We have visits, actually, I believe, on the docket for potentially Tim Walz, who is the running mate of Vice President Harris. Apparently, it's reported that he may be in the state in the very near future. Former President Donald Trump might be in the Philadelphia suburbs on Sunday. Point being, I'm going to these events and you get the opportunity to talk to the supporters, and it's interesting to talk to them on the ground about what issues are really driving them. Now, of course, if you're attending a political rally for each candidate, it's pretty clear which candidate they're supporting. But still, when you go to these events, you get to talk to them and ask them, what about your friends? How are they feeling about the election? So I think as I get to talk to more people, as I go to more of these events, I certainly will have an idea. But again, I think the one thing that is certain at this point in time, as we speak, 49 days until the election, that Pennsylvania seems to be really, really close. And I think both campaigns, if there's one thing they can agree on, is that Pennsylvania is very important, if not the most important state this cycle. 19 electoral votes. And if you look at all the national ratings outlets, like the Cook Political Report, Inside Elections, etc., all of them have Pennsylvania as a toss-up. And of like the 5 or 6 toss-up states, Pennsylvania is the one with the most electoral votes on the line. So I think that's the reason we've seen so many visits from both tickets to the state. And I think we're going to continue to see that in the next 7 weeks.
John Cole, always good to talk with you. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
More of the PCN Capitol Preview after this short break. Welcome back. Our guests are Sam Chen, Principal Director of the Liddell Group, and Mike Manzo, Senior Vice President of Government Affairs at Triad Strategies. As we're less than 2 months away from the general election, both presidential candidates have made several stops in Pennsylvania. Most recently, the Harris campaign in Johnstown and Wilkes-Barre last week. Mike, we'll start with you. What makes Pennsylvania so important that these presidential candidates keep coming back for visits?
Wow. Obviously 19 electoral votes. I think most models on both sides, if you talk to strategists and pollsters on both sides, show Pennsylvania being, the keystone state, right? I think Kamala Harris has about a 91% chance of winning the presidency if she wins Pennsylvania. Trump's at like 89%. So it's very, very difficult to find a path to Pennsylvania Avenue without actually winning Pennsylvania. So you've seen a lot of both of them. You're going to see a lot of both of them.
Sam, I'd like to turn this to you. Now, there are specific areas of Pennsylvania that seem to get the frequent visits, particularly northeastern Pennsylvania, the Erie region and so forth. Why do you think there are certain regions that are kind of determined hotbeds? What do you think of that?
Yeah, well, my home area, the Lehigh Valley, especially Northampton County, where I teach, we always call it Swing County, USA. You see Erie County, very similar. I think in counties like that, what you have are not just swing voters, but voters that are willing to split their tickets. So they might vote for Kamala Harris at the top of the ticket, Bob Casey, but then they might go Republican for a congressional race or a row office race. And so these counties are really microcosms of the greater United States. And so if you can win a county like that, it really does show that your appeal across the board is good, and it increases your chances of winning Pennsylvania and the country.
I'd like to look at poll data from, actually it was released from last night. USA Today Suffolk poll released Monday night. Kamala Harris, 49%, Donald Trump, 46%, excuse me, in a survey of 500 likely voters in the Commonwealth. The poll was conducted September 12th through the 15th. What do you make of that when you see a poll data like this? What do you draw from that information?
So I think the biggest thing for polling, for me at least, is looking at that poll and tracking it through the months coming into the election. I mean, all polls are going to be different. When they poll, who they're calling, what their algorithm is, really creates some skewed results in polling. So you look at one poll, in this case Suffolk, and you track what they're doing month after month after month, you get to see a trend. And I think that's the most important thing to look at. What's the trend? Right now, the trend is Harris picking up steam. She's coming in as a new candidate, not an unknown candidate, but new candidate. And a lot of questions about that candidacy, some early excitement. And then so now it's time to see if she picks up steam and if Trump is able to maintain where he is, or if he drops back, or if he has this kind of surge at the end. So you really look for the pattern of what's happening in these polls, and you gotta keep it with the same poll. So it doesn't help if you're doing Suffolk today, F&M tomorrow, the same poll. What's the pattern that we're seeing moving forward?
Mike, what do you draw from poll data?
Yeah, a lot of people they'll drop back to sort of polling averages. Sort of tracking the same poll over time is a great point. But a lot of people do the polling averages. I think what you've seen is, consistently since 2016, Donald Trump has a ceiling. He's got a ceiling with voters, and he's not demonstrated since 2020 that he's interested at all in growing sort of outside that ceiling. It is falling back to the base, talking to the base. So Kamala Harris's challenge is, how do I get to the people that he's not talking to anymore, that he's basically written off? You saw her close those Biden gaps, and some of those Biden gaps were significant, right? Coming towards the end of his candidacy. So she did a pretty good job right up front, just wiping out those gaps. But her struggle then has been, okay, now that I think Burwood Yost said yesterday, is stubbornly deadlocked in Pennsylvania. She's up 3 according to Suffolk. Probably it's still a tie in Pennsylvania for all intents and purposes. Her struggle here will be, how do I go from, hitting where his ceiling is to that last 3, 4, 5% that I'm going to need to take Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Georgia, whatever it may be.
Let's go back to July. How did the tone and trajectory of the race change with President Biden's withdrawal?
Well, I think the biggest issue for the Democrats up and down the ballot, and you see this sort of in down ballot polling, is enthusiasm. There were Democrats who were sort of resigned to vote for Joe Biden just because I didn't want to vote for Donald Trump. They had no enthusiasm about voting for Joe Biden. She has wiped out that enthusiasm gap too, which is really, really important, because now you're looking at a much more reliable voter sort of universe for her when you're doing GOTV on election day and pre-election day. Much more committed, much more enthusiastic about getting out there and voting for her. I think that's the biggest issue since he dropped out of this race. It wasn't, two sort of approaching 80-year-olds that no one really wanted. He left sort of Donald Trump standing there as the 78-year-old that, we'll see if they want him again.
Sam, if you were advising the Trump campaign, what kind of recommendations would you make now that he's facing a different opponent?
The first thing is he needs to get to talking about policy, right? This has been a campaign that has been run on hype. It's been run on excitement. And to some extent, it worked against President Biden, pointing out that this is somebody who is over 80 years old, pointing out some of these gaffes, these stumbles, that first debate performance that we saw over the summer. But now you've got a different candidate. And it's a candidate who, up until recently, didn't have a policy page on her campaign website. And you had an opportunity, the Trump campaign had an opportunity to really capitalize on that and start talking about policies, talking about what they believe the Biden administration had done wrong. But the one thing they've been focused on is hype and character and personality, which is something that Harris is leading in spades right now. So if I'm advising that campaign, it's you've got to pivot to policy. You've got to talk about what you did right in your 4 years in office, what you think this administration did wrong. Really come off of that hype of a campaign, focus on the policy, and then lastly, start bringing in people that aren't traditionally in your party or that are Trump supporters normally. So what Mike just said earlier, he isolates a lot of voters when he's talking. I mean, there are still Nikki Haley voters from the primary that he said were barred indefinitely, and he hasn't done anything to reach out to them and say, no, come back to the party, let's win this thing in November. He needs to do that if he wants to win swing states like Pennsylvania. How
does Kamala Harris balance between differentiating herself from Joe Biden, but also, acknowledging that she was part of his administration?
Sure, and that's a delicate dance, and she's done it on some issues fairly well. I think taking credit for, low unemployment rates, high job growth, high GDP, hasn't really been able to get around the inflation question. I was looking for that one moment, I think, in the debate where, it is, the constant refrain of, well, you've been there for 3.5 years. Why haven't you done this already? I wanted to ask Donald Trump, well, how much power did Mike Pence have under your presidency? Was your vice president pretty much running your policy too? But I think, she has to keep talking about that mix of what went well and the victories they can certainly hang their hats on, and then sort of pivot to that vision for, but here's what's next. Maybe we weren't perfect on this, but here's my plan for what's next on that issue, whether it's, high grocery prices or whatever. So it's a delicate dance. She succeeded on some issues, others not so much.
Since you mentioned vice presidents, I'd like each of you to talk a little bit about their running mate picks and what they bring to the ticket as well. Mike, if we'll start with you.
I think that Tim Walz was a great pick. I think he's a governor who has a real solid record of achievement for issues that the Democratic base really cares about. I will fall back to this. I still think, had she picked Josh Shapiro as her vice presidential candidate, I believe this race is probably close to being over. But that's water under the bridge, certainly. But I think Walz has done everything he can possibly do. I don't see what Vance brought or is bringing to the ticket. Doesn't bring sort of a different sort of viewpoint on anything. It doesn't necessarily deliver any states that Trump wasn't going to win anyway. And he's just been really awkward. Somebody who, called Donald Trump America's Hitler is now your vice presidential candidate. Like, that one was a head scratcher for me, and I don't know that the electorate is really out there embracing J.D. Vance's brand of whiskey.
Sam, your thoughts?
Yeah, I largely agree. I think both candidates missed opportunities in picking their vice presidents. I think with J.D. Vance, exactly what Mike said, this is really a mini younger version of Donald Trump, and certainly someone that is going to play well with Trump supporters. But what is he doing to broaden that base, right? And that's always the question. The Trump supporters are going to vote for the ticket. Didn't matter who he put on as vice president. But what he did in 2016 so effectively was he knew he had the weakness with conservative evangelicals, and so he went with Mike Pence to shore up that base. A pick like a Marco Rubio or a Tim Scott would have done that. I think similarly with the Walz pick, I agree with Mike. I think Governor Shapiro, again, Pennsylvania bias here, but I think Governor Shapiro would have almost made this race over and would have helped Democrats down ballot in Pennsylvania as well. Much more name recognition than Governor Walz. We certainly understand the personality we've seen from Tim Walz now, but Shapiro's much more moderate on a lot of these issues, again, broadening that Democratic base. So I think missed opportunities for both campaigns. When one of these campaigns is going to lose, and I think there's going to be a lot of questions about if they pick the right running mate.
Now, despite not being picked as a running mate, Governor Josh Shapiro is still stumping on behalf of the Harris campaign. How would you describe his role and how effective he is for garnering support for Pennsylvanians?
Well, I think Shapiro is key for the Harris campaign in this state, and even more so than Casey or Fetterman right now. I mean, Shapiro is popular across the board with Republicans, Democrats, and independents. We saw this when he ran for governor. Endorsements from Republicans of all brands, including James Schultz, who was a Trump White House attorney. So Shapiro is doing everything Democrats could want him to do right now in this state. And he's being a team player. And so I think he's crucial for them winning the state. I know there was some angst in the Harris campaign when they made that announcement. They were unveiling it in Philadelphia, and there are some angst about whether Philadelphia would be upset. I very tongue-in-cheek at that point said, look, it's Philadelphia. If you're not picking Jason Kelce as your running mate, they're going to be upset. But I think Shapiro's done everything he can to help that ticket, and they're going to need them.
Who are the undecided voters that the candidates are really focusing in on now?
There have to be very few at this point, one would imagine. I think, going back to what Sam said earlier, I think the undecided voters are largely in places where Josh Shapiro excels at going, whereas some Democratic governors weren't really interested in going to and talking to voters. So undecideds, look at places like Josh has gone, Governor Shapiro has gone, Beaver County, Johnstown. He goes to places where Democrats typically have written off and said, well, those are red counties now. We don't have to worry about Cambria County anymore. He very much goes to those places and makes the case on behalf of, he did it for himself when he ran for governor, and I think he's doing it now for Kamala Harris, and I think that's where you're going to see him in Erie a whole lot, I think. At the end of the day, you got Erie County that was Obama, Trump, Biden. We'll see what happens in Erie County now. I know that Suffolk poll had Harris up in Erie County, but those are the places where Josh is going to be the most effective for the Kamala Harris campaign, because he can do that. He's already done it as a governor. He's done it as a gubernatorial candidate. He goes to places that a lot of Democrats have sort of washed their hands of and said, well, that's great, but we're not going there.
What did both of you take from last week's presidential debate?
I thought that it was a critical error for running up to the campaign, for the Trump campaign, to try to paint Kamala Harris as some sort of an idiot who doesn't know how to string three sentences together. The woman was a career prosecutor who, won 2 U.S. Senate terms. It wasn't like she was, an unknown quantity. And they spent weeks telling everyone what an idiot she was. So she came off as having commanded the issues. She was, looking forward instead of, trying to relitigate everything from the past. I think that debate was an unmitigated disaster for Donald Trump. I think he came off as petty, small, and again, he wasn't talking about kitchen table issues. We can relitigate his performance all night long, and was she fed the questions was my favorite one. There's evidence that she knew the questions beforehand. The questions about the economy, inflation, the border, what did you think the questions were going to be about? I don't think she really needed them fed to her by anyone. They were just the questions, and if those type of questions trip up Donald Trump, maybe it's time to pack it in and let JD run.
Sam, your thoughts?
Hide your dogs, hide your cats. I mean, to Mike's point, it was a campaign, or it was a debate where the former president really focused on hype and a lot of just talking points that weren't really substantive. I think the debate in general lacked substance. A lot of platitudes about we want to see this done, but very little on the details. Now, in their defense, when you have 2 minutes to answer a question, it's hard to really unpack details of a plan. But a lot of platitudes, we'd love to see this done, love to see that done. Very, very little details on how we would get something done. But the Trump campaign coming to that debate in June really kind of downplayed the debate. We haven't done this in a while. Joe Biden's been the president. The Biden campaign really, the famous Joe Biden line, bring it on. And then you saw what happens. And this is politics 101. You don't talk up yourself or talk down your opponent before a debate. And so they walk in this way, as Mike said, and they're talking down Vice President Harris, talking themselves up, and the result was that she outshines, and she made sense. Whether agree or disagree with her on the policy, she made sense in the campaign. It was very different from what we saw in June. On the other hand, now the questions start rolling in about the former president. He is now the older man on the stage. He's now the one that's stumbling over answers, talking about immigrants eating dogs and cats and pets and just things that really didn't associate with the questions that were being asked. I don't think it was a good performance for the Trump campaign. I think we saw that in them not wanting to debate again. It's one that he does a lot better when he's at a rally, when he's speaking to his supporters, than when he is on that debate stage. And so, I think the proof is in the pudding. The campaign's now backed out of the future debates, and proof that they don't think they did very well either.
Now, Sam, a moment ago you had talked a little bit about you had wished that the Trump campaign focused a little bit more on issues and policy. What do you think has more influence on voters? Do voters base on issues and policy, or do they vote on personality and trustworthiness and those type of things?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the reason campaigns focus on personality, trustworthiness, things like that, is because that's what people vote on, right? We're voting for a person, that's not necessarily an idea. That being said, I think a lot of the voters that are already in their camps with their candidates, those tend to be the voters that have said, hey, I like the way that Donald Trump presents, or I like the way that Kamala Harris presents. And for that handful of undecided voters in those swing states, for the handful of those ticket-splitting voters in states like Pennsylvania and Georgia and Wisconsin, a lot of times those ticket splits do come down to the character of the candidate, and not just their personality, but their character, and then where they stand on certain policy items. So, for example, one of the large pro-life organizations, Life Action, their founder, Lila Rose, just announced the other day that they're no longer supporting former President Trump because of his shifts on the issue of abortion. Now, that doesn't mean they're going to go vote for Harris, right? She's very, very clearly pro-choice, but you're starting to see that there are movements inside some of these parties where traditional groups that might support one candidate or another, they might think twice because of something that is policy-driven and less so because of someone's personality.
Mike, your thoughts on this?
Yeah, and I think at this point in the campaign, a lot of voters have already sort of baked in the ideas of not necessarily specifically about issue 1, issue 2, issue 3. It's who they trust more to handle those issues, right? Consistently, they said they trust Donald Trump more on the economy. They trust him more on immigration. Harris kind of runs a table on the rest of it at this point. So, you look at the final 49 days, and what races typically come down to is the closing message, right? It's the closing message to sort of the people who are still fence sitters, the people who still really aren't totally, have their minds made up. So that closing message is really key. You had, going back into the past, you had the shining city on the hill. It's morning in America. 1,000 points of light. You had, the bridge to the 21st century, the Barack Obama, yes, we can. This is where Kamala Harris closes the deal. This is where her vision of what America could be and should be for the middle class compared to a closing argument of this is a third world country, we're all going to die. If I'm not reelected president, you're not going to have a country the next day. That's where the undecideds, not so much on policy, because I think those positions are kind of baked in now on who the voters trust to do that. The question is, who do voters really want to trust when it comes to the vision for tomorrow? And I think that is where she has a huge advantage over him. And if Donald Trump doesn't sort of flip that rhetoric and start talking about a brighter, more prosperous future for everyone, I think she closes him out, and it may not be as close as people think it might be.
Shortly after the debate, Taylor Swift endorsed Kamala Harris. What political impact did that endorsement have?
Excuse me. I'll start out by saying I'm a big fan of Taylor Swift. I don't know that it's going to have a huge impact. She is the largest cultural icon in the world. 284 million Instagram followers. It wasn't like Kamala Harris was really at a deficit with younger voters to begin with. It wasn't like she was lagging far behind Donald Trump in that segment of voters and really needed the kickstart from Taylor Swift. Will it happen on the margins? 400,000 new voters registered, if that's nationwide. Does it have an impact? Maybe, but I don't think it has. I don't think that was a big moment in the final wash.
And maybe more broadly, do endorsements have an impact regardless of whether it's a celebrity or perhaps an elected official?
I think celebrity endorsements have less of an impact. I really do. I think elected officials can. At this stage in a general election, you kind of expect Republicans to endorse Republicans and Democrats to endorse Democrats. And I think where an endorsement matters is when you have a Republican like former Vice President Dick Cheney endorsing Kamala Harris, where it maybe doesn't shift large portions of the voter base, but it gets some Republicans who maybe don't love Donald Trump. They start thinking, okay, wait, hold on. If the former vice president, who's very conservative, is going to endorse Kamala Harris, does that give me some cover to go over and endorse her? I don't think that, these parades at the convention, we see these parades of people who are elected officials in their respective parties endorsing. I don't know that makes that much of a difference. And I don't think celebrities, bring in that margin that much either. I will say with someone like Taylor Swift, I'd be curious to see if it gets younger voters to register and turn out. A lot of them support the vice president, but they don't vote. And so if there's a call to action in just voting and you see a higher turnout among younger voters, that would, in this race, benefit the vice president. So I'd be curious to see if it does that, if it dries up voter turnout among younger voters. But I don't know that there's somebody sitting at home undecided and they see Taylor Swift or Clint Eastwood and they go, oh, okay, decision made. I just don't see that happening.
We're going to continue our discussion in just a moment, but first I'd like to give our guests a brief break and look at some upcoming programming on PCN. Tonight, our On the Road Election 2024 series continues with Mercyhurst University on the spotlight on the legalization of marijuana. Students, faculty, a journalist, and a district attorney will participate. That's this evening at 8 o'clock. Tomorrow, the On the Road Election 2024 series tops off at Chatham University for a discussion with panelists and students about abortion policy. That starts tomorrow night at 8 o'clock. Journalist Roundtable returns with John Delano of KDKA-TV, Kristen Smith of the Center Square, and Linda Stein of the Delaware Valley Journal. That's Thursday at 7 p.m. The public affairs coverage you watch on PCN is now free online. Go to PCNTV.com and check out our streaming service, PCN Select. PCN is a 501c3 nonprofit television network that receives no government funding. We rely on viewers and donors like you to help PCN bring you everything Pennsylvania. To make a donation, visit PCNTV.com. Now, let's get back into our discussion about the election. Sam, you brought up a point that I wanted to talk about a little bit, and that is Republicans supporting the Harris campaign. In particular, you mentioned Dick Cheney. When I had spoken with John Cole a little earlier this morning, he talked about how former Republican Congressman Jim Greenwood was at a rally in Philadelphia this past weekend. What do you make of the Republicans that are supporting the Harris campaign?
Yeah, it's a great thing for Harris that you have Republicans that are coming over and publicly stating that they are supporting her campaign. And there's certainly much more of those than we see Democrats that are supporting former President Trump. There are Democrats supporting former President Trump, but you certainly see more prominent figures in the Republican Party that are supporting the vice president. The one thing where it's not as impactful as it could be is these are formers that are doing it. Former Congressman Jim Greenwood, former Congressman Adam Kinzinger, former Vice President Dick Cheney. So there is a sense of the sitting members. We haven't seen any sitting members come over. And a lot of these former members have already been written out of their respective parties. And you know, Dick Cheney, Adam Kinzinger, these are not moderate Republicans. These are conservative Republicans that likely disagree with Harris on a lot of the policy issues. But because they've already been written out by the Republican Party, Kinzinger for his opposition to Trump, for voting to impeach him, things like that, I think it carries less weight among Republicans. But again, among independents, which they're going to decide the races in swing states like Pennsylvania, Georgia, Wisconsin, there could be some movement as they see and listen to what these members are saying crossing party lines.
Mike, your thoughts on cross-party support?
Yeah, I agree with Sam. I think, and this will likely be the first and only time I ever vote the exact same way that Dick Cheney votes in a general election, so I'm really excited about that. But I think he's right. I think the other thing it does is sort of dampen enthusiasm, right? When you get really well-known and well-respected Republicans who say enough is enough, like, I've had it. You know, it's time for the Republicans to go back to the Republican roots, the smaller government Republicans, the strong military, strong foreign policy Republicans that I grew up with, you know, the free trade Republicans that I grew up with. You know, I think those folks standing up saying, okay, this isn't our party anymore. You know, we have to knock this off, and here's where we start. We have someone in Kamala Harris who's not some, you know, some crazy left-wing loon. I mean, they can try to paint Kamala Harris as being liberal all they want. You know, she was so liberal, she'd get no support in a Democratic primary. You know, that's how liberal she was. Whereas Bernie Sanders was mopping up votes in that particular primary. So, you know, I think they've dispatched with the whole idea that she's some sort of crazy liberal. And it's the Republicans, I think, who just have had enough of the direction of the party. It's not the one they grew up with. You know, I know Sam and I both done. We know Charlie Dent very well. You see some of these national figures, and I think it's very telling. Like, the only living vice president or president who is a Republican who's supporting Donald Trump is Sarah Palin. So, you know, you can say what you want about the comparison between Sarah Palin and Dick Cheney, but I think from a substantive, who really carries the Republican banner higher is probably Dick Cheney. So, you know, I think it's the dampening of the enthusiasm that really is key when it comes to these Republicans endorsing Kamala Harris.
I would add real quick, I think that on the dampening of the enthusiasm, also there are Republicans that aren't endorsing Harris, but they're publicly saying they're not going to vote for Donald Trump. So his former vice president, Mike Pence, our former senator, Pat Toomey, who aren't endorsing Harris, but they're not voting for Donald Trump, and that does the same thing. It really dampens the enthusiasm.
That's a great point, Sam, because as we mentioned earlier, you know, he's got a ceiling. Mm-hmm. He can't afford, you know, I'm not voting for Donald Trump is effectively a vote for Kamala Harris. So, you know, while some of them won't really, like, you have a Mitt Romney who says, never in a million years am I voting for that guy. I'm not voting for her either. But, you know, that is effectively a vote for Kamala Harris at this point. So those are very, very important.
There was a second assassination attempt against Donald Trump this past week. What do you think the political repercussions of that are?
I'll start by saying, I mean, and Mike, I know Mike agrees with me on this. There's just no place for this in our politics at all whatsoever, right? I mean, our politics should be about ideas, and we don't take out people that we disagree with. We sit down, we have debates with them. We don't say they can't speak. We don't say they can't exist. We have these debates, and so I think that just get that out of the way. Absolutely no place for this. I don't know that there are going to be significant political ramifications. I think after the first one, there was a bit of a bump for the former president. It was shocking that the shooter actually got the shots off out in Butler, Pennsylvania. In this case, the Secret Service spotted the person, took care of them, no shots were fired. And also, of course, the first time, it was the first time. It was very shocking for all of us who saw it. And so I think there's a little bit of a bump that went to the RNC, but these bumps go away. And I don't know that we're going to see it out of this one. And so I don't think there are political ramifications, positive or negative, for former President Trump or for Vice President Harris.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. There's no place for this in American politics. This is not how we solve our differences in this country. You know, we have the power of the ballot, the power of the vote, and these sort of incidents are horrible. I think the one thing that both parties need to do is take a step back. And let's not, I saw a bunch of Republicans rush onto national TV last week and say, well, it's the rhetoric out of the Harris, Walz committee, the campaign that is causing all this political violence. Democrats jumping to the defense. No. It was like all these months leading up to it was the horrible rhetoric of Donald Trump. I think it's time for both parties to take a step back and stop throwing sand at each other in the sandbox. Take a step back, take some ownership with the fact that we've got one of the most toxic political environments I've ever seen, and one party didn't create it. It's time for leaders, senior leaders of both parties, whether congressional leaders, senior folks who served a long time, whether it's a Mitch McConnell or Nancy Pelosi, take a step back and say, okay, everybody, enough is enough. Tone it down. This is the kind of stuff that's going to happen. It's terrible that it's happened twice already. It can happen again, and it might happen to Kamala Harris the next time. Everyone needs to take some ownership here. The problem is everyone talks like Sam and I do, that there's no place for this in American politics, but then 25 minutes later, they're running to meet the press to say why it's the other candidate's fault. If this would have never happened had so-and-so not said this about my person. Everyone needs to step back and say, enough's enough. Mind your own houses, Democrats and Republicans, on this one.
I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about some of the issues that have come up both within the campaign in general as well as specifically within the debate. First one being immigration. During the debate in particular, Donald Trump talked about, he asserted that millions of undocumented immigrants were entering the U.S. from jails and mental institutions. He made the comment that you had referred to earlier, that they were eating pets in Springfield, Ohio. Do you think an issue like this has traction in Pennsylvania, where our ag industry is our number one industry and we're so reliant on immigrant labor?
So immigration definitely is going to impact votes in Pennsylvania and across the country. And on the one end, I think most Americans support immigration. They support a path to immigration. That used to be a bedrock of the Republican Party. And I think most Americans have serious issues with illegal immigration. Democrats down in Washington, D.C., behind closed doors, will tell you that the southern border is a serious national security problem. Senator John Fetterman has vocalized this. And so that's generally agreed upon. And the question now becomes, what do you do with it? And I think when the former president says the things that he says, he's not addressing the issue. But what he does, instead of actually addressing how we increase immigration, how we decrease illegal immigration, how we secure the border, instead of actually coming up with plans for this, now what he's doing is he's isolating people who are, in this case, of Haitian descent. Same thing with his comments about Vice President Harris's race. He's now isolating voters that may have actually liked his candidacy, black voters, Haitian voters that may have agreed with him on certain policies. He's now icing them out. It's unhelpful to the conversation. And the worst thing is it doesn't move the ball forward on immigration at all, which is an issue, to your point, with the ag community here in Pennsylvania, with small business owners. This is a real issue for them. And you're not seeing anything proposed that moves the ball forward.
Yeah, I mean, I think what Donald Trump is doing on immigration, take a step back. Sam's right. And John Fetterman got roundly criticized by his colleagues for coming out very early and saying, we're ignoring a huge problem at the southern border, and that was the biggest, in my view, the biggest failure of the Biden-Harris administration was ignoring the southern border right up to the point where they couldn't anymore. Now, they did a great job of getting Senator Langford to introduce a bipartisan bill. We all know that worked out. That was their biggest policy failure by far of that administration. And Fetterman, once again, the canary in the coal mine, say what you want about John, but so Trump has had a very clear lead in how to deal with immigration, but what he's done is he's overplayed his hand. He's taken what should have been a sane debate on how do we stop illegal immigration, who has the best policy to do that, into these wild accusations, about Haitian immigrants. And it's like, who's the hated group of the day? Who's the threat to your livelihood today that's coming into this country? The number of illegal immigrants that Donald Trump talks about has gone from, 10 million to 11 million to 20 to 50. By the time election day is over, every single person in this country is going to be an illegal immigrant in Donald Trump's eyes. And the problem is, he's no longer focusing on the solutions at the border. Now it's, how many people can I deport that I don't like? And this is where he loses, I think, people who are willing to engage in the real discussion about immigration reform. When you look at immigration, the 222 corridor, you're looking from Reading all the way up through Hazleton. There's a really disparate view on immigration with Latino populations up through there. I mean, the further south you get, the more Democrat they vote typically. Go up to Hazleton, that was the home of, Lou Barletta. That's where this whole conversation sort of kind of began. So I think he's lost the script on immigration. And as long as she comes off being the sane person in the argument, I think she's going to at least hold her own.
Another ongoing issue, particularly during the debate, was Kamala Harris's shift in position over whether or not to support a fracking ban. Why was fracking in particular such a significant issue over other segments of the economy?
Well, I think that fracking in Pennsylvania has become sort of synonymous with, good-paying union jobs in Western Pennsylvania. Whether or not that is actually the case, I'm sure, it has certainly had a lot of benefits in Southwest Pennsylvania. So I think it was a good one for the campaign to latch on to because she did a pretty clear flip-flop on it. Let's be honest. It was, I'm going to ban it on day. Will you commit to banning it on day one? Yeah. Even though we all know presidents can't ban fracking on day one. Only Congress can do that. So I think it was a really smart move. And it's really one of the things that keeps resonating, I think, with Western Pennsylvania voters. Whether or not you do have a job that was caused or that was a product of the fracking industry, someone out there who does. Right? It was back like when my father worked for the steel industry out there. Not everyone worked in a steel mill, but everyone knew someone who did. So it's a smart move to keep pounding away on that issue. I think she's attacked it on several different angles. None of them are really going to stick. I think, on energy, she better articulate a really clear policy on what she's going to do next on energy.
I think politically, this is this Rust Belt region, right, is where Donald Trump thrives in 2016. This is how he wins against Hillary Clinton. And it's where Joe Biden takes it back in 2020. And so I think Harris looks at that and she knows she's got to be able to hold her own in these regions. Fracking is a big issue there. Fracking is one of those unique issues in the Democratic Party that really splits the party because you've got your environmentalists, your Green New Deal advocates, and they don't like fracking. They like that ban on fracking. But then you've got, to Mike's point, these labor union Democrats that see this as a jobs issue. This isn't just an energy issue. It's also a jobs issue for them. And so when you propose something like the Green New Deal, those Democrats feel like their jobs are going away. This was the famous Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez versus Conor Lamb showdown back a few Congresses ago. So it's very difficult to parse that in the Democratic Party. I think this is where you're seeing Harris's flip-flop on the issue. But she also realizes that while if you pull it nationally, where fracking ranks is probably not very high, but in specific states that matter, like this one, if it's just 3%, 4% of voters that care about this, that's enough to swing a state like this one. I think that's why that issue's come to prominence. And again, to Mike's point, it's an issue where she needs to lay out a clear plan. It's an inherent weakness for Democrats because of the divide in their party.
And it's one of those places, Sam. It's one of the places in the campaign where you're right. It's an energy issue, but it's a jobs issue. They almost become synonymous out there. So it's kind of a 2-for-1 for the Trump campaign, right? He's already more trusted on the economy to begin with, and now he gets to hit her on an energy issue where, he gets sort of two sort of bites at the apple. So you're in Southwest Pennsylvania. That's a big deal. I was out there not long ago doing some work, and I had KDKA on at night, and I'm watching the news, and the amount of fracking ads that I saw was incredible. They've pulled it, they've tested it, they know it resonates in Southwest Pennsylvania, and they'll keep banging away at it until there is an adequate answer from the Harris campaign.
The Dobbs issue was credited or blamed with helping Democrats in 2022. Does the issue of abortion still carry the same weight as we head into the 24 election?
I think it carries weight. I don't know if it's going to be the same as we move away from, as you move further from the decision. The other issues come, front of mind. I think one of the big issues with abortion, two things there. One, I think everyone says the economy, right, is the biggest issue. But I think it's, do you feel the impact of the economy? And so if you're struggling to put food on the table, yes, the economy is going to be a bigger issue than abortion. But if you're going to, your $25 lunch salad used to be $15, and you're sitting around complaining about it, you're still going and getting that $25 salad. So the economy hasn't really hit your pocketbook that much. Now other issues will come to the forefront. And so if abortion's a big issue for you, now that comes to the forefront. So I do think it's still, because a lot of these voters, their livelihoods haven't shifted that much economically, abortion's still going to be a big issue. The other thing, which I mentioned earlier, is the Republicans have shifted on this issue. And this is something where a lot of pro-life Republicans and the Democratic Party are going to continue to talk about Donald Trump banning abortion because they both want to believe it's true. But one of the realities here is that the president has said he no longer supports a federal ban on abortion, and he's actually lost some pro-life support over this. Again, is it a lot nationally? Probably not. But in some of these crucial states, if enough pro-lifers are now second-guessing their support for you, it could be enough to swing a state.
Is it a good or bad thing when a candidate shifts their position on something? We talked both about Donald Trump on abortion as well as Kamala Harris on a fracking ban. What do analysts make of these changes?
I think it's the voters who ultimately, make those calls. If you're coming from a place where the voters don't really trust you to begin with, and they find out you flip-flopped on 2 or 3 issues, now you got a real problem. If you've got a net positive rating with the general public. I'll use a Bob Casey, for example. Bob Casey has, an unusually high approval rating for an incumbent U.S. senator. So it's harder to make Bob Casey's a flip-flopper thing stick to him because people already know him, they like him, they trust him. When you're a candidate that no one necessarily trusts, I don't think anyone here would choose Donald Trump to sort of like watch their kids at night or babysit their dogs over Kamala Harris. So he's got a little trust issue to start with. So I think it's you got a real problem here when I was pro-choice all the way down the line. I support Hillary Clinton. I cut a check to Kamala Harris when she was Attorney General to I'm the pro-life warrior to I think 6 weeks might be a little too short. Maybe we need more time to, I don't even know if he knows where he is on abortion anymore. But early in the cycle, I kept hearing from Republican operatives that Dobbs won't be that big of an issue this time around. And it was literally trying to speak things into existence that weren't the case. There's still a whole lot of energy around that issue. And Sam's right. If your economic stance today and your position is fairly established and you're not feeling the real crunch of the economic crisis, then these issues really matter. And Donald Trump has done himself no favors on this issue since he got into office.
Do you think that this presidential race will have a coattail effect on other down-ticket races in Pennsylvania?
I think that you've seen a movement in generic ballot numbers. When you look at a lot of these polls, they do a generic ballot, and I think those are pretty indicative of how at least how the universe looks for down ballot races. It's been so close in Pennsylvania, it's hard to see. So when you look at sort of the control of the General Assembly, probably stays fairly close to what it is today. So I just don't, unless some huge event happens in the next 49 days and, Trump races out to a 10-point lead or Harris races out to a 10-point lead, I just don't see the down ballot effect this year. Because as Burwood said, we're kind of stubbornly deadlocked here, and for the next 49 days, it's going to be one of the margins.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think there's going to be a wave either way. I think Harris stabilized, her coming in with Biden dropping out, I think stabilized some of the Democrats in tighter seats, some of the incumbent Democrats in tighter seats. I don't think former President Trump has had coattails. We've seen a lot of his endorsed candidates over the years not do well, so I don't really think he brings coattails. People tend to vote for him and him alone. And again, this is a state that splits tickets. And so somebody could vote for Kamala Harris and then vote for Dave McCormick for Senate, or Donald Trump and then their Democrat candidate for Attorney General or something like that. So I don't, maybe some stabilization on the Democratic side with Harris on the ticket, but I don't see this, any kind of wave or coattails really coming in.
I think the Democrats are in a much better position today than they were when Biden was on the ticket, for sure, because there was no enthusiasm, and he had an unmanageable deficit in some of these swing states. If I would ask this question of a General Assembly leader from the Democratic Party 4 months ago, I would have got a lot different answer. I can assure you, they'd much rather be where they are today than they were going back when Biden was still leading the ticket.
Mike Manzo, Sam Chen, gentlemen, thank you both for joining us.
Thank you.
PCN spoke with Margarita Lopez Uribe, entomology professor at Penn State University, about a new species of bees appearing in Pennsylvania.
Margarita Lopez Uribe, associate professor of entomology at Penn State, welcome to our program. You were part of a group who discovered multiple new species of bees in Pennsylvania. Why is this discovery important?
Well, bees are extremely important for because they provide several ecosystem services, including pollination to our crops, but also pollination to plants in natural habitats. And we know that a lot of bees are in decline, both regionally and globally. So the documentation of where species are found and when they are found where is extremely important, because it can inform conservation, practices and decisions. So it's important to document bee biodiversity for that reason.
How did you discover these new species?
Well, so these new species are not new species to science. These species had been described before, but we did not know that the species occurred in Pennsylvania. And so we started really studying bee biodiversity in Pennsylvania about 8 years ago. We started trying to compile a list of species to understand, where bees are located historically and present in the present. And we, in that first study, we actually found a lot of gaps in, what we knew about bees. So if we look at the records of bees in Pennsylvania, we had what we call the university effect. So we had, a lot of bee records around Penn State, Drexel University, and, Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, right? Like a lot of, huge concentrations of data around universities. And this is where this project came about. So we decided to partner with community scientists across the state, and we partnered with master gardeners to document bees in other areas where we had, huge gaps of understanding. Doing this project, these master gardeners started, documenting new bees that no one had ever documented in the state.
How many different species of bees did you find that you've never seen in Pennsylvania before?
So for this study, we recorded 7 new species to the state, but we also did the same exercise at the county level, right? And so we also were building lists of species for all the counties in Pennsylvania. And when we looked at the county data, the new records are actually over 600, right? So the data that we collected through this project, has really benefited, the understanding of bee biodiversity statewide.
What differentiates these 7 species of bees from each other? Are they all honeybees? Are they carpenter bees?
No, they are, this is actually, a really cool aspect of the project. These are bees that are not very common. These are bees that are not likely to be documented, just with your bare eye. They tend to be really small. They are not honeybees or carpenter bees. They're actually very, very small. And some of them we actually found 2 species that are non-native to the U.S. among those, like 7 new species recorded in the state.
Who paid for this study and why did they want it done?
Yeah, so we've been very fortunate to receive funding both from Penn State and from the Department of Agriculture of Pennsylvania. They have been funding this project for 3 years now. And they are very invested in having an understanding of bee biodiversity patterns in the state because they realize how important bees are for agriculture, food security, in our economy.
Margarita Lopez Uribe, Associate Professor of Entomology at Penn State, thank you for your time.
Thank you.
That concludes today's show. Join us tonight for our 10th On the Road 2024 series at Mercyhurst University with the spotlight on the legalization of marijuana. Students, faculty, a journalist, and a district attorney will participate. That's tonight at 8 o'clock. I'm Francine Schertzer. Thank you for watching.